And so as we get started with our sermon time, I want to look at that theme today. We're going to be taking a look at 1 Samuel again, chapter 17. We're going to look today at 1 Samuel chapter 17. Now, this is a story you probably know. In fact, it seems like whenever we would have vacation Bible school, they would like to act out the stories for the kids. And somehow I always wound up being asked to help in the same story. Can you guess what story that might have been? David and Goliath. It must be because my name's David, right? That must be it. No, it's because I more resemble Goliath, and so they would sign me up to be the giant. And you know, that's not good on the knees when you always have to fall over like that. So I used to do that quite a bit. They'd act out David and Goliath, and I always seemed to wind up being Goliath. I'm going to start in verse 3. It says, "The Philistines stood on a mountain on one side, and Israel stood on a mountain on the other side, with a valley between them." Now, of course, this is still the time when Saul was king, and we saw that Saul had conflict with the Philistines throughout his life. And the Lord had used Jonathan, if we recall, we looked at it a few weeks ago, had used Jonathan to start that defeat of the Philistines some time back, and for a while they left, but now they're back again. And if you recall, the Philistines had been oppressing the Israelites for some time there before this, to where they couldn't even have weapons. They had to go to them to sharpen their farm implements. They were probably taking tribute from them. And now the Philistines are back thinking we need to get back to where we were before and put the Israelites in subjection to us. And so they line up the two armies together, but they do not immediately engage in battle. And between them is this valley. And it says, verse 4, "A champion went out from the camp of the Philistines named Goliath from Gath, whose height was 6 cubits and a span." That doesn't say much to a lot of folks. If you have one of the more paraphrased versions, it may tell you a little bit more of a calculation there. But what is a cubit? Does anyone know what a cubit is? It's from the elbow to the tip of the finger. Okay? Now, that can vary. Like if they use my arm, that'd be a lot longer, right? But roughly, they think about 18 inches, somewhere in there. And then a span, anyone know what that is? It's the distance between your little finger and your thumb, like this. Okay, so it's a little bit shorter than the cubit. If you look at your footnote, it may explain roughly how tall that was. So approximately 9 feet or a little bit more, almost 9.5 feet. Now, to put that into context, the tallest living human right now is about 8 foot 3 inches, which is quite tall. Considering I'm about 6'11", just imagine another another foot and more. That's quite a large person. The largest person in modern history was about 8'11", and this is even taller than that. And for a lot of folks who today are tall, they have giantism or a condition that can cause that. But in this case, it appears he was from a family of giants, because his brother is later referenced in Chronicles as also being giant in stature. And in fact, some people think he might be one of the Anakites, which were a family of giants that you see referenced in the Old Testament. In the book of Joshua, we see that they had wiped out most of the Anakites when they went into the Promised Land. We looked at that story a few weeks back, looking in Hebrews and also through the Old Testament about how they had to have faith to go in to the Promised Land. And at first the people rebelled. And so they wandered in the wilderness for 40 years, but then later they went in and had to take on these giants with the Lord's help. And they wiped most of them out, but there were still some, it said in Joshua, there were still some down in the cities of Gath and Ashdod and other places where the Philistines lived. So he may have been one of these Anakites, but whatever he was from a family of giants. And it says he was a champion. He had been a fighter, we're going to find out, for some time. And he was wanting to fight one of the Israelites in representative combat. So we're going to see what it says here, beginning in verse 5. He had a bronze helmet on his head, and he was armed with a coat of mail, and the weight of the coat was 5,000 shekels of bronze. And he had bronze armor on his legs, and a bronze javelin between his shoulders. Now the staff of his spear was like a weaver's beam, and his iron spearhead weighed 600 shekels, and a shield bearer went before him. Now that might not say much to you if you're not really familiar with armor and this sort of thing, but the whole description was meant to describe just how formidable he was. And so the first thing it mentions is he has this bronze helmet on his head, which is going to come up later when, of course, we see that it's in his head that he's hit. But it says he had a bronze helmet on his head, and he was armed with a coat of mail. Now, literally, it's a coat of scales. What that is, it's overlapping pieces of bronze that they would shape in the form of a scale, and they would overlap one another into a coat, if you will. And it says that it weighed 5,000 shekels of bronze. Anyone have a footnote that tells you how much that is, by the way? Yeah, and it translates to around 125 pounds. So imagine he's wearing just the breastplate itself, 125 pounds of bronze to protect him. Then he has the helmet, and it says that he was also wearing greaves. Now, this was unusual for the day to have this much armor. And probably this represented that he was such a great fighter that they invested a lot in him, because this would have been extremely costly. Most people wouldn't have anything near this as far as weapons and armor. And it says he had bronze armor on his legs and a bronze javelin between his shoulders. The staff of his spear was like a weaver's beam. Now, have you ever seen an old-fashioned loom? It's got a beam up here that the whole webbing of the strands hangs on. And then the weaver will use that to put together what they call the web in order to form the fabric. Now, this particular description is talking about probably the thickness of it. And of course, there's different types of looms, but what it's really getting at was he had a large spear that was formidable, that would be hard to grasp because it was so thick. And it says, and his iron spearhead weighed 600 shekels. Now, of all the descriptions, this one surprised me the most, because that would be roughly 15 pounds. Now, I don't know if you've ever, probably most of you never tried to use a spear or sword or this sort of thing. I mentioned a few weeks back, my brother is in a group that they get together and they reenact fighting in armor. Well, most swords and spears are going to be pretty light, because otherwise you can't swing them very well. Now, my brother, he's about my height and even bigger. He also fights with a spear. But if you gave him a spear with a 15-pound head, he'd have a hard time using it, even though he's 7 feet tall, because that is so much weight. And when you put it on the end of that shaft, that's so much leverage that it'd be very hard to manipulate. And everything about this is meant to say this guy is someone that you are not going to defeat in battle. It's giving us a picture of who he was. Now it says a shield bearer went before him, and we saw this with Jonathan also. It would be someone who would help him, like a squire, or someone who would be there for him, but it would also be someone to intercept incoming arrows or different things like that. And it says, he stood and cried out to the armies of Israel and said to them, why have you come out to line up for battle? Am I not a Philistine, and you the servants of Saul? Choose a man for yourselves, and let him come down to me. If he is able to fight with me and kill me, then we will be your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then you shall be our servants and serve us. Now that's quite a deal, right? They send out this giant human, 9 feet tall, coated completely in armor, and they say, if you can defeat him, we'll serve you. Now, it's a little unclear whether the purpose of this type of battle between champions was to decide the whole thing, or whether it was a sign of how the battle afterwards would go. But either way, the point being, he says, if you can defeat me, then we'll serve you. If I defeat you, then you'll have to serve us. And so it says, verse 10, the Philistines said, I defy the armies of Israel this day. Give me a man that we may fight together. And when Saul and all Israel heard these words of the Philistine, they were dismayed and greatly afraid. Now, we can't really blame them for being afraid when you see the description of this guy. We'd probably be afraid too, right? And yet, this is another sign that Saul had been turning away from the Lord. And we've seen this over the last several chapters. That at first it began with failure to obey what the Lord had commanded. But it also began with failure to trust in what the Lord would do. The Lord had told him to wait and that Samuel would come and sacrifice. But if you recall, Saul was so afraid his army would disperse that he failed to trust in the Lord. And here again, Saul should have been trusting in the Lord and going out to defend Israel, or one of the Israelites should have been, but they were afraid and they did not. Now Saul, by the way, when he was chosen, we mentioned he was taller, head and shoulders than the rest of the people. So he was pretty big himself, although certainly not as big as Goliath. But when he looked at this Philistine, he didn't want any part of that. Now it says, verse 12, we saw David last week introduced when he was anointed. And it says, now David was a son of that Ephrathite of Bethlehem, Judah, whose name was Jesse, and who had 8 sons. And that Ephrathite term is just referring to the area around Bethlehem, they think. And it said, the man was old and advanced in years in the days of Saul. The 3 oldest sons of Jesse had gone to follow Saul to the battle. The names of his 3 sons who went to the battle were Eliab, the firstborn, next to him Abinadab, and the third Shammah. Now we saw them last week. These were some of the ones that Samuel thought, well, they look like strong people who the Lord might choose to be his anointed, but of course the Lord did not choose them. He chose the youngest, David. And it says, David was the youngest, and the 3 oldest followed Saul. But David occasionally went and returned from Saul to feed his father's sheep at Bethlehem. Now, the part we didn't cover that you might want to read at home, David had been summoned to Saul's court because Saul, after he had abandoned the Lord took his spirit away from him, and he was constantly in distress. And it said he had a different type of spirit that would torment him. And so the only thing that would comfort him was to listen to some type of music. So David was summoned because it was heard that he played the harp, and he was summoned there to play for Saul in his distress. So he would go back and forth between watching the sheep and being in Saul's court. But his 3 brothers, the oldest at least, they were with Saul full time as soldiers now, defending the nation from the Philistines. And so verse 16, the Philistines drew near and presented themselves 40 days, morning and evening. Now, we read over that, but think about what that means. 40 days, morning and evening, twice a day, he'd go out and make the same speech. And for 40 days, the armies are lined up, wondering when they're going to fight. And the Israelites, for 40 days, are petrified about this giant. Now, can you imagine how nervous you would be after 40 days of hearing this twice a day and seeing this guy come up? And the whole army's just there waiting to see what's going to happen, but they're afraid and not knowing what to do. They'd have been better off to have faith and trust in the Lord, because any of them trusting in the Lord could use them to deliver, right? In fact, the Lord could deliver if he wanted, even without them. We've seen that before too. But he's wanting to show that he will work in their behalf when they trust him in faith. But no one here is trusting, and for 40 days they're there afraid, camped and waiting for the worst. And in verse 17, Jesse said to his son David, take now for your brother an ephah of this dried grain and these 10 loaves, and run to your brothers at the camp. And carry these 10 cheeses to the captain of the 1,000, and see how your brothers fare. And bring back news of them, or literally some token. Now, he sends them there with a couple different things. He sends them with bread and grain to take to his brothers. And he also sends cheese to the head of the army. Now, part of what they're doing here is they're trying to supply all these troops that for 40 days have been camped here trying to defend the nation. And all the people have to band together to help out. And so he sends that with him. And then he says, and bring back something so I know what's going on. Now, they interpret that differently. He might mean proof that he had delivered the items. He might mean news from the brothers. Either way, Jesse's concerned because now he has 3 of his sons out there wanting to hear what's happening to them. And it says, verse 19, Now Saul and they and all the men of Israel were in the valley of Elah fighting with the Philistines. Not yet fighting, but getting ready to in any case. So David rose early in the morning, left the sheep with a keeper, and took the things and went as Jesse had commanded him. And he came to the camp as the army was going out to the fight and shouting for the battle. For Israel and the Philistines had drawn up in battle array, army against army. So it reminds us what's happening here. They're still lined up, but they still haven't gone to battle. And David, verse 22, left his supplies in the hand of the supply keeper, ran to the army, and came and greeted his brothers. Now, we're going to see an interesting picture here of David's family dynamic. And even though the Lord had chosen David as a man after his own heart and given him the Spirit, there's still some conflict in the family. Now, that may tell us that even in the best of situations there can be conflict, but it may also tell us his brothers maybe didn't have that same heart, which is why they weren't chosen. But there's going to be a little bit of conflict here between him and one of his brothers. And it says, verse 23, Then as he talked with them, there was the champion, the Philistine of Gath, Goliath by name, coming up from the armies of the Philistines, and he spoke according to the same words. In other words, he gave the same speech once again. So David heard these words, and all the men of Israel, when they saw the man, fled from him and were dreadfully afraid. So every day they go out to battle, every day they see him twice a day, hear what he has to say, and then they retreat because they're afraid. And it says, verse 25, So the men of Israel said, Have you seen this man who has come up? I mean, it'd be hard not to, right? he's kind of an easy person to see. Have you seen this man who has come up? Surely he has come up to defy Israel. And it shall be that the man who kills him, the king will enrich with great riches, will give him his daughter and give his father's house exemption from taxes in Israel. Now, literally it just says we'll give him freedom. We don't know if that means freedom from taxes, if it means freedom from having his children enlisted in the army, some people think it even means he'll pay for them to live. We don't know exactly, but it's something good that you want. And so they've been there for 40 days. David shows up and they want to share what they're going through. And so the men are saying, look, this guy down here, he's been saying this over and over again. And if someone would defeat him, they'd be rewarded handsomely. And David, verse 26, David spoke to the men who stood by him, saying, What shall be done for the man who kills this Philistine and takes away the reproach from Israel? So they've been talking about this. He asked them the question, and he says, For who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? Now David is asking him this question, and notice how he phrases it, very similar to what Jonathan said. He emphasizes them being uncircumcised. Now, for us, that wouldn't mean much. But for them, it's a sign that God has made a covenant with Israel. He's promised to deliver them. He's promised to help them when they trust in him. And so David says, who is this guy who's defying the armies of Israel? And who is he really defying? He says the armies of the living God. He's defying God, not just us. And he says, this uncircumcised Philistine, why are we allowing him to do this? Do we really think that God will do what he said? And David is asking about this. The people answered in verse 27 in this manner, saying, So shall it be done for the man who kills him. So they relate to him what they've been talking about, that whoever does this will get a reward. Now David has perhaps a reason for asking around here. He starts asking different people so that the word gets back to Saul about what his feeling on the matter is. And it says, verse 28, Now Eliab, his oldest brother, heard when he spoke to the men, and Eliab's anger was aroused against David, and he said, Why did you come down here? And with whom have you left those few sheep in the wilderness? Now, what's he saying? Now, David's job was to watch the sheep, which was not a glamorous job. And he's saying, we don't have very many sheep anyway. Why are you here? Shouldn't you be watching them? He was upset that David was there. Now, of course, why was David there? Because Jesse had sent him, right? His father had sent him for that task. But Eliab wasn't interested in David showing up, first of all, because it meant that he would be embarrassed in front of David because he had not been willing to go out and fight the giant, right? And here they are for 40 days scared, wondering what's going to happen. It wasn't anything great to write home about. Oh, how's the battle going? Well, we're over here quaking and wondering if we're going to die soon. That's not a good report, right? And David sees this, and Eliab's like, why don't you go back home? Why are you here? And he says, I know your pride and the insolence of your heart. Now, this might be what they call projection, right? But he says, I know your pride, the insolence of your heart, for you have come down here to see the battle. He goes, you were bored and wanted to come see some excitement. Now, is that true? Is that why he was there? No. But his brother, and maybe this relates back to when David was anointed, maybe he was jealous. We don't know. But he sees David here, and it grates on him. Now, David, on the other hand, he was sent there to find out what's happening. But when he gets there, he sees this giant, and he's asking the question that all of them should have been asking, which is, can't the Lord do something about that? And why aren't we doing something about it? So verse 29, David said, what have I done now? Is there not a cause? Or some of them interpret it, I only spoke a word. I'm just asking, right? I'm just asking what's going on. Then he turned from him toward another and said the same thing. And these people answered him as the first ones did. So David keeps going around and talking to all the people and saying, who is this guy and why is this happening? Now he wants them to understand that they should be trusting in the Lord. And when this gets spread around and people hear about it, verse 31, the words which David spoke were heard. They reported them to Saul, and he sent for him. It gets back to Saul, and Saul says, well, bring him here and let's see what he has to say. Because keep in mind, for Saul, this could be a threat to morale, or it could be an opportunity if there's someone who could defeat the giant. It says, verse 32, David said to Saul, let no man's heart fail because of him. Your servant will go and fight with this Philistine. So David says, don't worry, I've got it covered, we'll go fight him. And Saul said to David, you are not able to go against this Philistine to fight with him, for you are a youth, and he a man of war from his youth. Now, what's he saying there? I saw a couple puzzled looks. He's saying he's been fighting from the time he was your age. And he's experienced, and he's stronger. And what is Saul doing again? He's looking at it just from a human point of view. He's saying you don't have a chance. Because he's been fighting all along, and he's bigger, stronger, better equipped. You can't do it. And then it says, verse 34, David said to Saul, your servant used to keep his father's sheep, and when a lion or a bear came and took a lamb out of the flock, I went after it and struck it and delivered the lamb from its mouth. And when I first read this, I was kind of thinking along the lines of, oh, you've ever heard that song, Davy Crockett, King of the Wild Frontier? I see a few nods. It was from like a Disney movie and maybe written before that, I don't know. But the Ballad of Davy Crockett, I think is the official name. And at one point it says he killed him a bear when he was only 3. Now, that seems a little far-fetched, right? And I think that whole thing was meant to be far-fetched. And at first when you read this, it's like, okay, so this young guy killed a bear and a lion, and it's almost like we think of he's bragging, right? But what we're going to see is he's not bragging at all. But he says it was the Lord who delivered him from the lion and from the bear. And so it says, verse 35, we're going to jump back a bit. I went out after it and struck it and delivered the lamb from its mouth. And when it rose against me, I caught it by its beard and struck and killed it. Your servant has killed both lion and bear, and this uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, seeing he has defied the armies of the living God. Moreover, David said, the Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear, he will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine. And so David says, yes, I've killed both bear and lion, but it wasn't me. Who was it? It was the Lord who delivered me, right? And he's saying, just like Jonathan said, the Lord's hand is not prevented from saving, whether by many or by few. David had that same faith that Jonathan did that Saul didn't have. And he not only had the faith, but he was willing to put it into action. And so he says, God will deliver me. And Saul said to David, go, and the Lord be with you. He realized that David had this faith, and he didn't want to argue with that, even though he lacked that faith. Now Saul clothed, it says verse 38, so Saul clothed David with his armor, and he put a bronze helmet on his head. He also clothed him with a coat of mail. David fastened his sword to his armor and tried to walk, for he had not tested them, or as some of the more modern versions put, he wasn't accustomed to wearing that type of armor. And David said to Saul, I cannot walk with these, for I have not tested them. So David took them off. Now, there were probably very few suits of armor, because remember, just a short time before, they didn't have any weapons at all. And Saul was taller than everybody else, so it wouldn't even fit right. But not only that, David's used to just living out with the sheep. He wasn't used to wearing armor and carrying all this heavy equipment. And so he said, I can't take that. Now, it would have put him a little more on par with Goliath, having all that bronze armor and equipment. But David wasn't depending on the equipment, right? He wasn't depending on what could be provided for him. He's depending on the Lord. And so it says, verse 40, then he took his staff in his hand. He chose for himself 5 smooth stones from the brook and put them in a shepherd's bag, in a pouch which he had, and a sling was in his hand. And he drew near to the Philistine. So the Philistine came and began drawing near to David. Now remember, they're on different mountains. They have to get down to this valley, right? So the Philistine, after all these days, finally sees someone to fight him, starts coming closer. And it says, the Philistine came and began drawing near to David, and the man who bore the shield went before him. And when the Philistine looked about and saw David, he disdained him, for he was only a youth, ruddy and good-looking. So he says, why have you sent this young person out to me who's never fought in a battle? This can't really be your champion, right? Not only that, he was equipped with what? A stick and a sling. And so he's insulted. He said, you wait all these days, none of you had the courage to fight me, and now you send out a kid with a stick. And so, of course, one of the things that was very important back then was honor. And to him, this was dishonoring him. And so the Philistine said to David, am I a dog that you come to me with sticks? So he wasn't impressed with his equipment, and the Philistine cursed David by his gods. And the Philistine said to David, now here's an example of trash talking in the ancient Near East. Come to me, and I will give your flesh to the birds of the air and the beasts of the field. Now, what's he talking about? He says, you're going to be carrion for all the scavengers, right? So he's upset. He wants David to come over, and he plans on defeating him rather rapidly. But verse 45 is David's response, and David said to the Philistine, you come to me with a sword, with a spear, and with a javelin. But I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hand, and I will strike you and take your head from you. And this day I will give the carcasses of the camp of the Philistines to the birds of the air and the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel. He said it's not about the weapons, it's about the one who's going to act in our behalf. Now it says, verse 47, then all this assembly shall know that the Lord does not save with sword and spear, for the battle is what? The battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hands. So it was when the Philistine arose and came and drew near to meet David, that David hurried and ran towards the army to meet the Philistine. Then David put his hand in his bag and took out a stone, and he slung it and struck the Philistine in his forehead, so that the stone sank into his forehead, and he fell on his face to the earth. Now, have you ever seen one of these slings? It's 2 pieces of rope or leather with a little pouch, and they swing them above their head, usually, and it can sling it up to 100 to 150 miles an hour. And it's a rock, usually about, from examples at least from Lachish and different places where they use them militarily, it's a rock maybe as big as 3 inches around. Here it hits him. It's almost like he tries to maintain his balance, but then he falls forward on his face. And it says that, verse 50, so David prevailed over the Philistine with a sling and a stone, and struck the Philistine and killed him. But there was no sword in the hand of David. Therefore David ran and stood over the Philistine, took his sword, and drew it out of the sheath, and killed him, and cut off his head with it. David had claimed he was going to do this by the Lord's help, and now the Lord brought it about. And when the Philistines saw that their champion was dead, they fled. Why did they flee? Because they realized there's no way this could have happened naturally. This had to be the Lord working. And because of that, they knew that if they stayed, they would be in even worse shape. When the Philistines saw that their champion was dead, they fled. And the men of Israel and Judah arose and shouted and pursued the Philistines as far as the entrance of the valley and to the gates of Ekron. That's one of their cities. And the wounded of the Philistines fell along the road to the Sharim, even as far as Gath and Ekron. So in other words, exactly what David had said would happen, happened, right? But how did David know that would happen? And this is where I want to talk about what lessons we can draw from this. We often talk about faith and how we have to have faith and we can't do it ourselves. But throughout all of these stories, faith was put into action. When we look at Jonathan, Jonathan said, the Lord is able to save. Then Jonathan went up with just 2 people and attacked a garrison of 20 men. How many of us would want to do that? And yet the Lord did deliver them. We see that when it came to Saul, he was supposed to put his faith into action and trust what Samuel had said, but he did not do it. And now here David sees that the Lord has promised to uphold his covenant, to deliver them. And he says, if God has promised it, why are we all waiting around with this Philistine to find the Lord? We should go do it. And so I want to ask the question, are we putting our faith into action? David, as he went out to face Goliath, he knew already the Lord had promised to deliver. What are some things the Lord has promised to do in our life? What are some actions we know He wants us to do? And then once we know that, we should be what? We should be doing them, expecting Him to work with His Spirit. Well, one of them is to overcome sin. He expects us to trust in His Spirit to put to death the sinful nature. And that requires not just saying, Lord, I'm going to trust in you, take away all my sin. It requires, as the Scriptures say, that we work out our salvation with fear and trembling, for it is God who works in us to will and to do according to His good pleasure. We have to determine that we're going to put away sin with the Lord's changing our minds and hearts. That He's going to work in us, but we have to make the decision to do that. Are you giving excuses to sin, saying, well, there's no way I can stop sinning? Now, am I saying you're going to be perfect? No, the Lord is perfect. But He does say He wants to work in you, right? Do you take that seriously? What else has He called us to do? He's called us to share the gospel. Do we believe what He says, that He'll give us the words to say? And if we do, then we have to act. And so the question is, as people look at our lives, can they see faith in action? Are we trusting in what the Lord would have us to do? Another thing He's commanded us to do is to help others. Are we doing that? Do we see that faith in action? Throughout this whole book of Samuel, we see that faith is recognized by what they do. And we saw the same thing in the New Testament, in case you're thinking it was just an Old Testament thing. James said that faith without works is what? Is dead. Faith without works is dead. He says, if you say you have faith, great, I'll show you my faith by what I do. Now, we're saved by faith. We're saved in trusting the Lord. But that should move us to do what the Lord has commanded. And so I want to challenge you today. If the Lord is putting something in your life today that He wants you to do, whether it's trusting in Him to put to death that sinful nature, whether it's sharing with others, whether it's ministering to others, whatever it is that He has for you to do, we need to put that into action through our faith. It is not by our strength, but it is by His, but it has to be something that we act on, or it's not really faith. That our actions show what faith does in us. Let us pray at this time. Loving Heavenly Father, Lord, I pray that we would learn that lesson that David and Jonathan and many others have learned, that it is not us that makes a difference, but it is you. But we have to trust you enough to do what you've commanded. And we have to trust you enough that when we put our hope in you, we know that you'll do what your word has said. And we pray that you would work in each one of us to be faithful to you, we ask in Jesus' name. Amen.